So, part 3, last part, ang haba talaga nito. 59 slides eh. Kahit ako napapagod na. Pero last part na to. Konting slides na lang. Now, part 3, PSA 250, which is consideration of laws and regulations in an audit of financial statements. So, pupunta na tayo sa pagko-consider ng mga batas or mga regulations provided by the authority, by the government in relation to the audit of financial statements. Now, anong scope ng PSA 250? Well, it deals with the auditor's responsibility to consider laws and regulations in an audit of financial statements. So, easy to understand. Ito yung responsibility ng auditor pagdating sa kung anong sinasabi ng batas, ano ang sinasabi ng regulations provided by the authority, which is basically the government. So, ano bang effects ng laws and regulations pagdating sa audit? Well, the provisions of some laws or regulations have a direct effect on the financial statements in that they determine the reported amounts and disclosures in an entity's financial statement. So, basically, ang kino-consider lang dito na laws and regulations is yung mga laws and regulations na kung saan yung effect nila is direct sa financial statements na kung saan yung mga laws and regulations na yun, they determine or they facilitate the determination of those reported amounts and disclosures in the entity, which is dito sa atin sa Pilipinas is the, well, basically yung pag-follow ng financial reporting standards. Kasi kapag magdi-deal ka sa mga government institutions like BIR, SEC, and others, yung consideration ng pag-follow ng financial reporting standards is tinitake into account. And because of that, may direct effect yung mga yun, yung pag-compel o pag-mandatory ng pag-follow ng mga financial reporting standards. Kasi pag magdi-deal ka sa government, kino-consider nila yun. Now, responsibility for compliance with laws and regulation. Now, take into account that it is the responsibility of the management with the oversight of those charged with governance to ensure that the entity's operation are conducted in accordance with the provisions of laws and regulations. So, take into account or dapat alalahanin nyo na si management with the oversight of those charged with government ang may responsibility in regards to complying with laws and regulations. Sila ang may responsibility. Now, kung silang may responsibility, ano naman kay auditor? Ano naman ang labot ni auditor? Ano naman ang labot nito sa audit of financial statements? Well, sabi ng PSA, or this PSA is designed to assist the auditor in identifying material misstatements of the financial statements due to non-compliance with laws and regulations. Yan yung responsibility ng auditor to identify if may material misstatement sa financial statements that is caused by non-compliance with laws and regulations. Yun yung responsibility ni auditor. Tandaan, ang pag-comply ng laws and regulations kay management with the oversight of those charged with governance, ang kay auditor, ang responsibility niya is to identify material misstatements sa FS that is caused by the non-compliance with laws and regulations. Auditor is not responsible for preventing non-compliance and cannot be expected to detect non-compliance with all laws and regulations. Hindi yan responsibility ni auditor. Now, reiterating kung anong paulit-ulit natin sinasabi since the beginning, the auditor is responsible for obtaining reasonable assurance that the financial statements taken as a whole are free from material misstatements whether caused by fraud or error. O ito, nakalagay nito, paulit-ulit natin yang sinasabi kasi at the end of the day, yan talaga yung primary responsibility ni auditor. Now, in this case, taking into account applicable legal and regulatory framework. So, ito talaga yung at the end of the day, ang primary responsibility ni auditor. Now, in this particular context, ano yung inherent limitations na may encounter ni auditor? Well, first is, there are many laws and regulations that typically do not affect the financial statements. For example, Yung bayanihan to heal as one act, anong effect nun sa financial statements? Wala, di ba? So, marami talaga mga batas and regulations na nilaan si government, nilaan ng authority na wala namang effect sa FS ng company. So, inherent limitations yun. Second, the non-compliance may involve conduct designed to conceal it. Now, anong ibig sabihin nito? Ibig sabihin, hindi yan error. Ibig sabihin, may bad faith on the part of the perpetrator. And kapag may bad faith on the part of the perpetrator, may deception yan. May reason yan sa to conceal it. Like may proactive on his part na itago yung kasalanan niya. And alam natin, pag ganun yung nangyari, mas mahirap yung detection ng misstatement. Or, in this particular case, the detection of the non-compliance. Third is matter for legal determination by a court of law. Tandaan mo, auditor ka, hindi ka abogado, hindi ka judge sa korte. So, mahirapan ka talaga unless na may humingi ka ng legal advice in terms of legal matters kasi hindi ka abogado, CPA ka. Iba yung field of expertise mo, hindi batas, kundi accounting or auditing in this particular case. So, yung tatlo, inherent limitations yan. Now, ano bang objectives ng PSA 250? Well, it is to obtain sufficient, appropriate evidence regarding compliance with provisions of those laws and regulations generally recognized to have direct effect. Tandaan nyo, yung mga may direct effect lang on the determination of material amounts and disclosures in the financial statements. So, laws and regulations na may direct effect sa determination ng material amounts. Tandaan nyo talaga, yung direct effect lang. Second is to perform specified audit procedures to help identify instances of non-compliance with other laws and regulations that may have a material effect on the financial statement. So, na-determine mo na may mga parts na kailangan ng specific audit procedures. Kasi na-sense mo na, parang kung may non-compliance dito, may material effect sa financial statements. So, kailangan mo mag-perform ng specific audit procedures. Third, to respond appropriately to non-compliance or suspected non-compliance with laws and regulations identified during the audit. Now, ano ba ang non-compliance? Kanina pa natin ito sinasabi. Ano ba ang non-compliance? Well, it is the act of omission or commission by the entity, either intentional or unintentional, which are contrary to the prevailing laws or regulations. Basically, nilabag mong batas. Now, the auditor's consideration of compliance with laws and regulations. Ano bang mga consideration na gagawin ni auditor? First, auditor shall obtain understanding on legal and regulatory framework applicable to the entity. Kaya tayo may RFBT na subject. And if the entity is complying with it. So, ito, anong sabi nito? Alamin ni auditor kung ano yung mga batas, ano yung mga regulations na na-apply kay entity. And second, determine kung si entity ba nagko-comply dito. Paano niya malalaman? I-audit ni auditor. Paano niya malalaman through audit? Kapag may misstatements na kung saan nangyari yung misstatement na yun due to non-compliance. Doon malalaman ni auditor if the entity is complying with it. Pero hindi niya responsibility yun. Ang primary responsibility ng auditor is to know that the financial statement is free from material misstatement, whether due to fraud or error, that taking into the concept the compliance with the laws and regulation. So yun. Second is dito, audit procedures to perform, inquiring of management. Magtatanong si auditor. Second is inspecting correspondence. Now ano to? Well, dito kasi ito yung, pero sa next module na to, pero sabihin ko na lang, ito yung inspecting, yung magtatanong ka sa abogado mismo, sa legal counsel ni management or ng company. Like magtatanong ka yung, may mga liabilities ba or may mga suit ba or may mga kaso ba to si entity. Yan yung mga inspecting correspondence. Pero sa module 3 na yan, for further discussion. Now, audit procedure when non-compliance is identified or suspected. Paano pag na-identify mo, parang may ano dito parang may non-compliance dito Anong gagawin ni auditor? Well, first, the auditor shall discuss the matter with the management and, where appropriate, those charged with governance. Most especially kapag yung suspected non-compliance is on the part of the management, didiretso si auditor kay governance or those charged with governance. Second, the auditor shall consider the need to obtain legal advice, most especially kapag walang idea si auditor kasi CPA siya, hindi siya abogado. So, mas maganda kung maghingi siya ng legal advice. Especially, there's no cooperation and such compliance is material. Kasi iba naman ang expertise ng CPA sa accounting, ang abogado sa batas and regulation. Third is, the auditor shall evaluate the effect of the lack of sufficient appropriate evidence on the auditor's opinion. Fourth is, the auditor shall evaluate the implications of non-compliance in relation to other aspects of the audit. Basically, dito, may effect ba ang non-compliance na to sa ibang gagawin, sa ibang audit procedures na gagawin ni auditor? May ibang effect ba to? Nakaka-affect ba to? So, yun. Now, paano ang reporting ng identified or suspected non-compliance? Well, first, reporting non-compliance to those charged with governance. Siyempre, communicate those charged with governance. If believed to be intentional or material, report as soon as practicable to them para magawan ng paraan. Kasi ang mga intentional or material, may adverse effect talaga yan sa company. Now, if such are involved, kung those charged with governance mismo ang involved sa non-compliance, na ang gagawin ni auditor, it shall communicate the matter to the next higher level of authority at the entity. Well, usually, yung mga charged with governance, that's the highest level of authority with the entity. So, ang gagawin na lang talaga is pupunta sa authority, sa legal authority, sa government offices, ganun. If no other choices, the auditor shall consider the need to obtain legal advices. Pero siyempre, before magsusumbong si auditor sa legal authorities, sa government, mag-aas muna siya ng legal advice kasi, gaya na sabi ko, ang expertise niya na sa accounting. Ang expertise naman ng mga abogado sa laws and regulations. So, since ganun ang sistema, kailangan maghingi ng payo ni auditor kung ano ang dapat niyang gagawin. Now, next, reporting non-compliance to regulatory and enforcement authorities. Magre-report na siya sa government. Auditor shall determine whether the auditor has a responsibility to report the identified or suspected non-compliance with or to parties outside the entity. Siyempre, hindi ka basta-basta magre-report. Tingnan mo muna kung ano yung mga possible or mga legal remedies na pwede mong i-undertake. Kasi may mga batas tayong sinusunod, kapatid. Now, reporting non-compliance in the auditor's report on the financial statement. Now, paano mo siya i-report sa auditor's opinion mo, sa auditor's report mo at the end of the audit? Well, first, if non-compliance has material effect and was not adequately reflected sa FS, express a qualified opinion or an adverse opinion on the financial statement. Yan is kung yung non-compliance is material ang effect and was not adequately reflected sa financial statements. Now, paano pag yung management or those charged with governance prevents the auditor from obtaining sufficient appropriate evidence that are believed to be material? Express a qualified or a disclaimer sa opinion mo sa financial statements na kung saan ang basis mo is limitation on the scope of the audit. Scope limitation, kapatid. Kapag scope limitation ang nangyari, qualified or disclaimer ang gagawin mo. Bakit? Kasi hindi mo the management or those charged with governance mismo ang nag-prevent sa'yo to do any further audit procedures. Sila na mismo nag-prevent na, wag mo yang gagawin. Kapag yun ang nangyari, ibig sabihin, ang nangyari is scope limitation. And kapag scope limitation ang naging reason, qualified or disclaimer ang ibibigay mo. Now, if there are limitations imposed other than by the management or charged with governance, and such limitations prevents the auditor from knowing if non-compliance has occurred. The auditor shall evaluate the effects on the auditor's opinion. Now, tapos na tayo sa ano. Punta naman tayo kay PSA 260, which is communication with those charged with governance. Siyempre, kailangan may proper communication sa nag-hire sa'yo. Now, anong scope ng PSA 260? Deals with the auditor's responsibility to communicate with those charged with governance in an audit of financial statements. Ito, may responsibility sa auditor makipag-communicate doon sa nag-hire sa kanya. Of course, kailangan may proper communication yan. Recognizing the importance of effective two-way. Tandaan nyo, two-way communication. Hindi lang yan one-way. Dapat pareho silang nagko-communicate. Bilateral, kumbaga. In an audit of financial statements, this PSA provides an overarching framework for the auditor's communication with those charged with governance and identifies some specific matters to be communicated with them. Now, anong objectives ni PSA 260? Well, first, to communicate clearly with those charged with governance the responsibilities of the auditor in relation to the financial statement audit and an overview of the planned scope and timing of the audit. So, sasabihin ni auditor, itong overall audit strategy ko. Pero of course, kung sasabihin mo kung anong gagawin mo sa yung overall strategy, audit strategy mo, huwag mo silang bigyan ng specific para hindi masira yung reliability ng gagawin mong audit. Sabihin mo lang na yung overall na gagawin mo. Huwag mo silang bibigyan ng specific. Second, to obtain from those charged with government information relevant to the audit. Siyempre, tanungin mo. Baka may mga alam sila na maaaring makatulong sa pag-perform mo ng audit procedures. Third is to provide those charged with governance with timely reservations or observations arising from the audit that are significant and relevant to their responsibility to oversee the financial reporting process and to promote effective two-way communication between the auditor and those charged with governance. Now, those charged with governance. The auditor shall determine the appropriate persons within the entity governance structure with whom to communicate. Well, kung matatandaan nyo, yung mga board, those charged with governance, usually yan sila, yung mga board of directors. And if kung matatandaan nyo, yung mga company o yung mga board of directors na yan, within them, meron tayong tinatawag na audit committee. Natatandaan nyo pa? Yung audit committee. Which is usually made up of three members of the board na kung saan sila yung may responsibility over the internal audit and other audit staffs within their company. Na ito yung minimin na appropriate persons, lalo na pag may audit committee yung company. Kasi usually yung auditor, diyan siya may direct communication sa audit committee. Since yung audit committee ang may responsibility sa audit staffs within the company. So, wala lang. I-remind ko lang yung existence ng audit committee. 2 M, no? Pati 2 T ba yun? Next is governance structures vary by jurisdiction and by entity, reflecting influences such as different cultural and legal backgrounds and size and ownership of characteristics. So, siyempre, may mga different considerations, may mga different factors within that entity or within that company that the auditor should take into consideration. Kasi, hindi naman lahat ng company pare-pareho, may mga distinct features yan sila. Now, communication with the subgroup of those charged with governance, the auditor shall determine the auditor also needs to communicate with the governing body. So, basically, same lang dito, parang si audit, parang si audit committee rin. Or si audit committee talaga ang usually ang naka-assign talaga dyan. Now, siyempre, may responsibility ka na makipag-communicate. Now, ano dapat ang mga kailangan mong i-communicate? Which is the matters to be communicated. First is the auditor's responsibility or responsibilities in relation to the financial statement audit. Second, plan, scope, and timing of the audit. Third is significant findings from the audit. And fourth, auditor's independence. So, ito yung mga kailangang sabihin ni auditor sa company na about sa audit ng statement, paano niya gagawin, ano yung mga significant findings na nakita niya sa audit, and i-reiterate niya or i-emphasize na yung pagiging independent niya. Now, ang communication process naman. The auditor shall communicate with those charged with governance the form, timing, and expected general content of communications. So, kita nyo dito, general content. Huwag kang mag-specific. The auditor shall communicate in writing, always yan, para may proper documentation ka. Yan yung purpose yan. Para may proper documentation ka. Kaya dapat always in writing, kapatid. Always kang magdo-document. Kasi ang proper audit, nakadepende yan sa proper documentation. Now, the auditor shall communicate with those charged with governance on a timely basis. Siyempre, dapat, and such may vary depending on the engagement. Now, punta naman tayo kay PSA 265, which is communicating deficiencies in internal control to those charged with governance and management. Ito, nakita mo, may deficiencies, may lapses sa internal control ng company. So, kailangan mong i-communicate yun sa mga nag-manage or sa mga nag-govern ng company. It is your responsibility as the auditor. Now, anong scope ng PSA 265? Well, first is, it deals with the auditor's responsibility to communicate appropriately to those charged with governance and management deficiencies in internal control that the auditor has identified in an audit of financial statements. So, responsibility niya yan para i-relay yung nakita niyang deficiencies sa internal control ng company. Yun yung scope. Now, pagdating sa objective naman, parang pareho lang. The objective of the auditor is to communicate appropriately to those charged with governance and management deficiencies in internal control that the auditor has identified during the audit and that, in the auditor's professional judgment, are of sufficient importance to merit their respective attention. Now, definitions tayo. Ano ba ang deficiency in internal control? Well, accordingly, this exists when a control is designed, implemented, or operated in such a way that it is unable to prevent or detect and correct misstatements in the financial statement on a timely basis. So basically, yung control na yan, ibig sabihin, pangit yung control because hindi niya nagagawa yung purpose niya. Next is, which is to prevent a misstatement in the financial statement. Second is a control necessary to prevent or detect and correct misstatements in a financial statement on a timely basis is missing. So, dito sa una, may internal control. May control. Pero yung control na yun, pangit kasi hindi niya nagagawa yung trabaho niya, which is to prevent, detect, or correct a misstatement. Now, dito naman sa second, wala talagang control at the first place. So, dito, may control pero pangit. Dito, wala talagang control. Now, significant deficiency paano naman kapag yung deficiency sa internal control is significant? Well, ito yung a deficiency or combination of deficiencies in internal control that in the auditor's professional judgment is of sufficient importance to merit the attention of those charged with governance. Ibig sabihin, napaka-significant ng deficiency na to that it will already have an adverse effect or a material effect sa company that, as the word itself, significant, that based on the auditor's professional judgment, kailangan niya talagang i-report sa those charged with governance or sa management. Now, ano bang mga requirements dito para i-report niya? Well, the auditor shall determine whether, on a basis of the audit work performed, the auditor has identified one or more deficiencies in internal control. So, dito, tiningnan niya kung may na-determine ba siya o may na-identify ba siyang deficiency sa internal control. Now, dito sa second requirement, kapag may na-identify siyang deficiency sa internal control, ang gagawin ni auditor is i-determine niya on the basis of the auditor performed whether individually or in combination they constitute significant deficiencies. Bakit? Kasi ang i-report mo lang sa sa those charged with governance or sa management sa management is yung mga deficiencies sa internal control na significant. Yung mga significant deficiencies in internal control lang ang i-report mo. Tandaan nyo yan. Now, third step, the third requirement, the auditor shall communicate in writing significant deficiencies in internal control identified during the audit to those charged with governance on a timely basis na na-determine na ni auditor na yung mga deficiencies is significant. Ngayon, i-report niya na yun or i-communicate niya na yun so those charged with governance on a timely basis, siyempre in writing. Bakit in writing? Kasi proper documentation talaga ang priority sa audit. Now, the fourth requirement is the auditor shall also communicate to those charged with management at an appropriate level of responsibility on a timely basis. Kita nyo dito, an appropriate level. Siyempre, titingnan ni auditor, baka yung significant deficiency sa internal control na yun is merong iba na nasa management ang may pakana or may gumawa or ang may responsibility over that. Siyempre, titingnan niya kaninong appropriate level or saang appropriate level siya ng management pwedeng mag-report. And last requirement is the auditor shall include in the written communication of significant deficiencies in internal control. Siyempre, kailangan niyang ilagay ang description ng deficiency na yon and an explanation kung ano ang magiging potential effects nun ng deficiency na yon. And second, sufficient information to enable those charged with governance and management to understand the context of the communication. So, ito yung mga requirements para si auditor or kung papaano gagawin yung auditor yung steps para mag-communicate ng significant deficiencies sa internal control to those charged with governance and kay management. So, ang haba-haba, part 1 pa lang yan. Next part is next slide na. Pero joke lang, end na. Pasensya na, sobrang mahaba. 59 slides kasi to, kahit ako napagod na. So, stay safe kayo dyan. Bye-bye!